Welcome to Charles Dickens' A Brain on Fire, a series that digs deep into the life and works of one of the greatest novelists of all time. Hi everyone, happy 10th day of Christmas. Twelfth night is nearly upon us, but while the lights and decorations are still up, I thought it would be fun to look at one more Christmas story. It's an odd one, nearly entirely forgotten or ignored. The poor relation amongst Dickens's other 4 Christmas books. To many, it's even a bit of a sentimental embarrassment. However, today I'm determined to look with fresh eyes on the battle of life and see if there's any kind of epiphany to be had with it. Early on in the story, Dickens describes the traces of an ancient battleground and imagines what would happen if the spirits of all the dead soldiers were to rise again.
If the host slain upon the field could have been for a moment reanimated in the forms in which they fell, each upon the spot that was the bed of his untimely death, gashed and ghastly soldiers would have stared in, hundreds deep, at household door and window, and would have risen on the hearths of quiet homes.
It's as if, in that moment, Dickens is saying to the reader, if this story were going to feature ghosts, it would go something like this. But the image of hauntings is quickly dispensed with, and the world of these characters becomes a strictly temporal one. There is, however, a mad, frenzied ritual around the hearth of Dr. Jeddler's mansion, where the fire is piled higher and higher, and at the peak of festive dancing and merriment, Dr. Jeddler's youngest daughter, Marion, disappears. Other haunting moments, perhaps, are the ghosts of Dickens's own ideas, that will appear again in later, more substantial works. Such as the moment where the lawyers, Snitchy and Craggs, hold a candle for their lovesick client, Michael Warden, as he walks down a staircase. As he descends, Warden declares, "Henceforth the star of my destiny is Marion," to which one of the lawyers remarks, "Take care of the stairs, sir, for she don't shine there." A clear pre-echo of the moment Pip calls for Estella at Satis house. Her light came along the dark passage like a star. Today I'm thrilled to be joined by the brilliant writer Katie Lumsden, an alumna of both Durham and Bath Spa universities, and whose debut novel The Secrets of Hartwood Hall will be published by Penguin in March. A link to pre-order this is in the description wherever you're listening to this episode. Katie also hosts the hugely successful YouTube channel Books and Things, where she examines in detail the mountains of literature she reads her way through each year. And reading excerpts from The Battle of Life is the wonderful Sophie Reynolds, who is the curator at Jane Austen's house in Chawton, and who you may have heard before reading excerpts from the Grip episode in this series. I hope you enjoy it. Katie, hello.
Hi, nice to be here.
Oh, it's lovely to have you here, and you're on a special mission today because we are going to look at The Battle of Life, the most forgotten of Dickens's Christmas books by a long way. But I saw on your YouTube channel that you actually really rate this story, and I have to say that I really like it too, but there are plenty of people out there that aren't fans of it at all. So I wondered, would you be interested in helping make the case for this book?
Yeah.
What do you love about it and admire about it?
I think it's interesting because Dickens wrote 5 Christmas novellas, and The Christmas Carol is the most famous by such a long way. But then even of the other 4, not many of them are talked about very often, and The Battle of Life is hardly talked about at all. But I really like it. I think some people don't like it. I think some of Dickens falls into the sentimental a bit, and I think that went down really well in the Victorian period, and that's probably one of the things within Dickens that goes down the least well today, because I don't think people really enjoy the kind of over sentimental stuff within Dickens, but I quite like it because it's quite sweet and it's quite fun. I quite like The Battle of Life for a few different reasons. One is that it's quite ambitious as a novella. Like, it's quite a short, I think it's about 100 pages in the edition I've got. But it spans sort of a decade, and it's in 3 parts. One at the beginning, and then sort of 3 years later, and then 6 years later. And we're following this family and various side characters over a decade of their lives. And that's quite nice because that's quite different. And I also think The Battle of Life has some kind of wonderful side characters as well as its main plot. There's a pair of lawyers in it who I think are an excellent pair and just sort of wonderful Dickensian creations. And Dickens, he's such a wonderful writer of characters in general, but I feel actually there are some fantastic characters in some of his Christmas novellas which get forgotten in comparison to A Christmas Carol, I suppose.
Yes, everything pales next to A Christmas Carol, doesn't it? In our awareness and consciousness.
Yeah.
I mean, if we had all those adaptations of the Battle of Life every year, maybe it would be more. But one thing I do like about it is I suppose it's the subtext right through the whole story, and it's represented by this battleground, isn't it, at the start, and somehow that battle that happened centuries ago, and the story takes place 100 years before Dickens is writing as well.
Yeah.
So there's something about that battlefield haunting everything and people referring to it.
One thing I love about Dickens in general is his kind of balance of light and shade, and how he's very good at having the very grim stuff and the very funny, happy stuff. And The Battle of Life is in many ways a very kind of sweet, sentimental story, but also the first sort of 3 pages of it are several centuries ago, a terrible battle happened in this place and hundreds of people died. And actually that, starting off at the beginning of this novella, kind of does weave throughout it this knowledge that something really terrible happened here, and that this place where maybe nice things can happen is a place where something terrible happened. And actually that it's important to remember that even when life is good, that also bad things have happened in the past, and that even when happiness can come, sometimes sacrifice and pain must happen first. And actually there's quite a lot in The Battle of Life as a novella about kind of sacrifice and joy coming out of sacrifice and joy coming out of pain. And that kind of sense of this terrible thing that happened in this place a long time ago is kind of really important throughout The Battle of Life, I think.
And the writing, there's not much display in his own writing in this story.
No.
Which is interesting. I think that's where it falls down for people. They go, oh, where's all the fizz and the fun and the fireworks and a big spinning plot?
On the one hand, it's more ambitious than his other novellas, and it takes place over a long period of time and has more characters, but also it's a sort of simpler story in some ways. I feel like The Battle of Life is quite Shakespearean in that it has these kind of like 3 acts to it, and it's got kind of, certain things about the ending are a little bit contrived, but it also has a lot of messages in it, which for me feels kind of Shakespearean, I suppose. And it's got like the central plot and then the kind of more comic side characters, I suppose, but who also themselves have the seriousness in them. And one of the characters who I like in it is the Doctor, who has this theory of life, that life's just a joke. And basically his theory of life and the idea that life's just a joke comes from the fact that he lives in this place where this terrible thing happened centuries ago, and the world is actually so awful that he feels like he would be driven to despair unless he's just decided that's a joke, so it's fine, so he can cope with it. And that's his kind of coping mechanism.
Dr. Jedler was, as I have said, a great philosopher, and the heart and mystery of his philosophy was to look upon the world as a gigantic practical joke, as something too absurd to be considered seriously by any rational man. A kind and generous man by nature, he had stumbled by chance over that common philosopher's stone which sometimes trips up kind and generous men, and has the fatal property of turning gold to dross and every precious thing to poor account.
And he kind of has to learn over The Battle of Life that actually there are some things in life that you need to take seriously, and maybe that will help you in life. But that's kind of interesting in itself, I think. And that's kind of a curious message, I suppose.
No, I think it's an amazing message, isn't it? He says at the end something about we're all hearts or something, doesn't he?
Yeah.
Because he moves on. That's the big thing he has to learn.
Yeah.
Is not to be flippant and to have the courage actually to feel and take things seriously.
Yeah.
Which I think is quite a modern thing, isn't it? People can be very ironic and sort of throw away, and he learns it through the love of his younger daughter. But what I love is, if we go through the beginning, you've got this big sweep of the battlefield from this very wide lens, and some really fantastic prose, as you would expect from Dickens, describing the seasons and the growth and all of that. And then you end up in this orchard with these 2 young sisters dancing, which I think is an amazing image, isn't it?
Yeah, the kind of juxtaposition of the battle and then the kind of like innocent youth, the 2 girls enjoying themselves dancing. And I think also the way Dickens kind of writes about the countryside in The Battle of Life, because it's a really like rural idyll story, I suppose. But also it's this place where something terrible happened a long time ago. So that kind of contrast between the beauty of the English countryside built on war is quite interesting. And he really sums it up in the beginning when he goes from, the battle to Marion and Grace dancing, I think.
2 girls danced merrily together on the grass, while some 6 peasant women standing on ladders gathering the apples from the trees stopped in their work to look down and share their enjoyment. A beautiful day, a retired spot, and the 2 girls, quite unconstrained and careless, danced in the freedom and gaiety of their hearts. As they danced among the orchard trees, and down the groves of stems, and back again, and twirled each other lightly round and round, the influence of their airy motion seemed to spread and spread in the sun-lighted scene, like an expanding circle in the water. Their streaming hair and fluttering skirts, the elastic grass beneath their feet, the boughs that rustled in the morning air, the flashing leaves, the speckled shadows on the soft green ground.
As a woman, I'm sure you're very tuned into how Dickens writes in quite a lot of these Christmas books. He sort of slightly quite fancies a lot of the women he writes about.
Yeah, every now and then it's a bit. I feel like that's something you encounter a lot in Dickens. I'm really interested in gender in Dickens, and I think, especially in his early works, he's quite patronising towards women. And then by his later novels, I feel like his female characters are fantastic. But it kind of takes him a long time to learn how to write female characters, I think. And I quite like Grace and Marion in The Battle of Life, but certainly there is a sense to which Dickens is kind of like, oh, look at how cute and beautiful they are.
Yeah, but I sense, I don't know, do you sense that Marion and Grace are fully rounded female characters, that you could believe them and two young sisters?
I think so. I often I think I often think this with a lot of pairs of sisters in literature, but they sort of remind me of the Eleanor Marianne dynamic in Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility, where you have the kind of elder, more sensible sister who is kind of a bit more emotionally oppressed, and then you have the younger sister who is kind of more emotional and lively. But actually, the younger sister here does also have, like, she is also able to read emotions and to kind of make a sacrifice in the course of the book, and she also has kind of the emotional strength that she doesn't necessarily seem to have on the surface in the way her elder sister does. But I do feel like they are both quite interesting characters to look at, especially because Dickens kind of holds things back about them until towards the end of the novella.
Yes. How would you, for anyone listening, and probably most people listening don't know The Battle of Life, how would you sort of set up, without too many spoilers, the beginning of this?
Yeah, so after we're told about the battle that happened in this place many years ago, we move to Marion and Grace, these two young women dancing. And they're both the daughters of a local doctor. And the local doctor, as well as having his two daughters, also has a ward who is a young man called Alfred. And at the beginning of The Battle of Life, we learn that Alfred is about to go away for a long time, but he's also engaged to be married to the younger sister, Marion. They've all kind of grown up together, and he is going away to learn and continue his education, but he intends to come back kind of in the future to claim Marion as his wife. And in the kind of opening of The Battle of Life, we meet this family and Alfred, and we also meet two lawyers who have kind of come to the going away party of Alfred because they're kind of involved in the trust fund that's been left for him. And I really like these two lawyers, Craggs and Snitchy, there we go. Snitchy and Craggs. Snitchy and Craggs, who are an excellent pair who kind of see themselves as a unit in their kind of like personal and professional lives.
Yes.
And always kind of refer to each other by Mr. Snitchy always says Craggs and Self and Craggs, as though they are one person, which I really like. And we also meet the two servants of the house, Clemency and Britain, who are quite interesting characters too. And in the opening of The Battle of Life, we know that Alfred's going to go away, and then we know that we're going to follow them in their later life and find out what happens when Alfred returns in the next part. And The Battle of Life is split, as I said, into three parts, which takes place at different points in time. Yeah.
Yes, 3 acts. That's a very, very clear opening. I'm glad I put that on you to do. that was really well done. Something that you've hinted at as well already is that because it's out of the city, isn't it? We're never in the city. We're never in narrow streets, gaslight and fog or anything like that. And so you've constantly got this wide lens over it all the time, which is quite pleasant, really.
Yeah, and in many ways it's not that Dickensian, because I think we often, actually Dickens does write quite a lot about the countryside, but we often think of Dickens as being London, and Dickens is London and, thin alleyways and everything. Whereas actually The Battle of Life is much more kind of rural and pastoral, which is a sort of different tone for him, I guess.
Yes. And you mentioning it being quite Shakespearean and being in 3 acts.
Yeah.
It's interesting because it's almost as if Dickens is slightly writing it for the stage. I think, the sentimentality at the end feels very theatrical and declaimed, doesn't it? The kind of.
It does, yeah.
So the second part opens in the office of Snitchy and Craggs.
It does. And they're talking to a man called Michael Warden, who we don't know very much about, except that he's ruined. He's spent all his money. He's probably behaved badly in life and wasted away all his money, is the implication. Yeah. And he has been told that he has to leave England. But he decides that if he wants to leave England, he'd quite like to take Marion with him, because he has been living for a while at the doctor's house due to an injury, and he has fallen in love with Marion, who is already engaged to Alfred, and we don't know what's going to happen. We also hear just after that Alfred is soon to come home, and this is sort of around Christmas time. They're going to have this big Christmassy party to welcome Alfred home, and what is going to happen from there.
And it's a very Christmassy section of the book, isn't it? It's got some fantastic Dickensian descriptions of the holly and the snow and the fires and all of that. And that's one of the criticisms levelled at it, is, well, it's not Christmassy.
It is. I feel like The Cricket on the Hearth is the Dickens Christmas book that is not Christmassy at all, fun as it is. But yeah, The Battle of Life, of its 3 parts, only one is Christmassy, but actually the middle part of The Battle of Life is really festive and does have this lovely description of this kind of like big country Christmas ball, which is really fun and delightful.
Yes.
Because it was the Christmas season, and his eyes were all unused to English holly and its sturdy green, the dancing room was garlanded and hung with it, and the red berries gleamed an English welcome to him, peeping from among the leaves. Now the music struck up, and the dance commenced. The bright fire crackled and sparkled, and in its exultation leaped and bounded like a mad thing up the broad old chimney. He saw it, yes, from the chaise he caught the light as he turned the corner by the old church. There was a frosty rime upon the trees, which, in the faint light of the clouded moon, hung upon the smaller branches like dead garlands. Withered leaves crackled and snapped beneath his feet as he crept softly on towards the house. The desolation of a winter night sat brooding on the earth and in the sky, but the red light came cheerily towards him from the windows. Figures passed and repassed there, and the hum and murmur of voices greeted his ear sweetly.
And again, you go back to the dancing again, and there's a real kind of climax in this moment, isn't there, in this second act, where something happens to Marion when they're at the Christmas party. Dr. Jedler is saying, pile more logs on the fire, and the fire is blazing higher and higher, and Alfred, who's been away for those 3 years, is on his way back to meet Marion, to be married. And it's just so, I find that very sort of powerful, that whole section.
A crowd of figures came from the house. Among them was the father, with a paper in his hand. "What is it?" cried Alfred, grasping his hair with his hands and looking in an agony from face to face. "Will no one look at me? Will no one speak to me? Does no one know me?" There was a murmur among them. "She has gone." "Gone?" he echoed. "Fled, my dear Alfred," said the doctor in a broken voice, and with his hands before his face. "Gone from her home and us, tonight. She writes that she has made her innocent and blameless choice, entreats that we will forgive her, prays that we will not forget her, and is gone." "With whom? Where?" He started up, as if to follow in pursuit. The snow fell, fast and thick. He looked round upon the whitening ground, and thought how Marion's footprints would be hushed and covered up as soon as made, and even that remembrance of her blotted out.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that it's not necessarily very Dickensian in the way you expect it to be.
Yeah, and actually he does a lot of different things, and one of the things I really like about Dickens is he was writing over a very long period of time, and his early books are very, very different to his later books. And in general, I slightly prefer his later books, but I do think like the change in tone and characterization across his career is huge. And actually what we think of as Dickensian is often like A Christmas Carol. And actually Dickens is so much more and so much more varied than that.
Yes.
And he writes about so many different themes and so many different subjects and so many different kinds of characters and so many different styles in some ways, that it's very hard to like narrow down what Dickensian means.
Yes, absolutely it is, yeah. So we've got a little bit of a sense of the plot in there. So what was the effect of reading it for you? How do you feel sort of personally towards it?
So it wouldn't be my number one Christmas book. I do think A Christmas Carol is the best. Partly, I think, because I feel like it's almost harder to have like a more perfect thing for what it is. Like I feel like it's just very, very perfect as a work, and I love A Christmas Carol a lot. I also have a big fondness for The Haunted Man, which I think is a really very underrated ghostly Christmassy story.
Well then, if you'd like to, we can sort of cut into some of these others if you want to.
Yeah, so The Haunted Man is great because it's this ghost story about this man who is haunted by a kind of ghost of himself, and the ghost of himself offers him a bargain, saying, "I can take away all your pain, all the memories of sadness in your past. I can take it all away." But what the man doesn't realize is that when the ghost takes away all his memories of sorrow in his past, he also takes away his empathy. And there's a lot more going on in The Haunted Man than that. But I think that central premise of, well, actually, without the memory of sorrow, would you have any empathy? And without the memories of your past, would you still be the same person? I feel like that premise is so fascinating in The Haunted Man. And that's one of the things I love about it. And I feel like The Haunted Man, maybe more than any of the other Christmas stories, is the most underrated in that I feel like it always could have the same role as A Christmas Carol. Like it almost does have similar messages and similar kind of things explored, but it is very, very forgotten.
Yes.
Yeah.
It doesn't have that. There's no overflowing generous Christmas froth, is there?
No,
you have to work a bit harder.
It's a bit more stark, isn't it, as a story?
Yes, exactly. Yes, and even the Christmassiness of it is very spare. You know, and Holly's put up in Redlaw's study, and it withers very quickly, doesn't it, with the appearance of the apparition of himself? But the Haunted Man, what an excellent book that is.
Yeah, it's a fantastic book.
So obviously, A Christmas Carol first. I mean, I don't think anyone can make the argument not to put The Christmas Carol first.
Not, yeah.
So followed by The Haunted Man. I'm really interested in this. And then
either The Battle of Life or The Cricket on the Hearth.
Oh, okay.
I'm not sure which.
Oh, well, this is interesting then. So vying for third place then is The Cricket on the Hearth and The Battle. So The Cricket on the Hearth then, where does that possibly earn its place then?
I just really like The Cricket on the Hearth. I think it's quite fun. Like The Battle of Life, it's a bit convenient in places and it isn't necessarily very realistic, but it is also quite like a sweet, fun, almost Shakespearean story. You know, there's like mistaken identities and stuff in The Cricket on the Hearth. And although it isn't Christmassy, I'm not even sure whether it's clearly set at winter. There's like a toy maker and it's a bit kind of fairy tale, and that gives it a nice kind of Christmassy feel, even though it's not a very Christmassy story.
I agree. It might actually take place in January. The Cricket on the Hearth. I don't know why I think that.
It's been a couple of years since I read The Cricket on the Hearth last. So I have read it twice before, but it's been a few years, so I can't remember.
I'll take that for that one. I'll say it's January. I think it's January. And John Peerybingle is a carrier, isn't he? So he's always delivering parcels and things. And so you have that element. And then, of course, you have the toy makers. And you have this evil toy maker merchant in charge, Tackleton.
Yeah,
who's like,
it's great.
Scrooge with a horrible sort of squint.
The relationship between the central characters of The Cricket on the Hearth, this married couple, and the husband's a little bit older than the wife, and he's a bit self-conscious about it, and he's really worried that maybe she doesn't love him as much as he loves her. And actually, they have quite a nice relationship, and their marriage is quite nicely portrayed, I think, and quite nicely explored. Because actually, Dickens is sort of very famous for being this great domestic writer who writes a lot about happily married, happy families. Whereas actually, there's very few happy families in Dickens. All the husbands and wives are miserable, or one of them is dead. And actually, A Christmas Carol is one of the rare Dickensian occasions where you do get, the Cratchits are this kind of perfect family who Dickens has a reputation for writing, but actually didn't write very many of. Actually, one of the things I really like about Dickens is he writes a lot about found families, and a lot of his family structures are very complicated and not nuclear at all. But anyway, I like in The Cricket on the Hearth, it has this kind of married couple who do have quite a nice relationship, but also they're not quite certain of each other because they don't fully communicate with each other or don't have like a full understanding. And I quite like that dynamic between them, I suppose.
Okay, so The Cricket on the Hearth, I think it's good. I've said this so many times, okay, but I just forgive the listeners will forgive me. But the first 6 pages, though, do you find them a bit trying? All that stuff about the cricket and the kettle and the
maybe. I don't know. It's quite fun though with the kind of what began it and was it I don't know. Sometimes I like it when Dickens goes on a long irrelevant tangent because I just quite enjoy his writing. So sometimes I kind of don't mind.
No, but it's his great strength, isn't it? Is the sort of slight sort of quirky randomness of it, the fact that he's in the room with you like a sort of favourite uncle.
Yeah, and Dickens. One of the things I love about Dickens is very weird. And I think people who haven't read Dickens before don't realise how odd and eccentric Dickens is. Yeah. Like I always think one of my favourite bits of A Christmas Carol is the opening where Dickens says Marley was dead as a doornail. I don't know why a doornail should be a good simile for death. Why would a doornail be dead? Surely it would be a coffin nail. And that kind of bit from A Christmas Carol, I just find that really entertaining because it's so very Dickens, just kind of, I've used a simile, now I'm going to examine it in detail for no reason.
Yes.
This is quite delightful, I suppose.
Yes, it is. It is absolutely right. I just think that impulse that he has there and that lack of restraint falls down just in the beginning of The Cricket of the Hearth. But once the characters come in, then you get drawn into this very appealing little story. So it's vying with the Battle of Life. And so if you had to bring the Battle of Life and knock Cricket on a Hearth out of third place, what's the main thing about the Battle of Life? Because I went into this episode with you quite prepared to think that actually, well, maybe it's not as good. Maybe everyone's right. Maybe it's just not as brilliant as I'm trying to make it.
I do like it. Yeah, I think I think they are quite similar stories in tone, I would say, The Cricket on the Hearth and The Battle of Life. And I like both of them. But in The Battle of Life, I do like the 3-act structure and I do like the minor characters. And I think especially the kind of two pairs of minor characters, Clemency and Britain, the two servants, I like them. And I think Clemency is a really interesting character because everyone thinks she's really stupid and she's actually not. And actually, as you go through the story, you realize that everyone's just decided that she's stupid because she's a bit clumsy, and actually she's got a lot of emotional intelligence and her emotions run really deep, and actually she knows more about how to live life than a lot of the rest of them do. And I think that's quite nice.
Clemency is amazing. I think she's possibly my favourite character because, what's clever about this is actually Dickens makes her the comic relief a little bit, doesn't he? He sets her up, makes her ridiculous, talking about how her arms are all in the wrong place and legs and everything.
Yeah. To say that she had 2 left legs and somebody else's arms, and that all 4 limbs seemed to be out of joint and to start from perfectly wrong places when they were set in motion, is to offer the mildest outline of the reality. Her dress was a prodigious pair of self-willed shoes that never wanted to go where her feet went, blue stockings, a printed gown of many colours, and the most hideous pattern procurable for money.
And then at some point there's this moment where he talks about how capable she is.
Yeah.
And how if it wasn't for her, the inn that she runs with her husband, Britain, would fail, and actually how easy it is for people to look at people that are a bit quirky and mock them, when actually if you look deeper, you realise they're actually worth more than you are, possibly.
It was she who managed the whole house by her plain, straightforward thrift, good humour, honesty and industry. So easy it is, in any degree of life, as the world very often finds it, to take those cheerful natures that never assert their merit at their own modest valuation, and to conceive a flippant liking of people for their outward oddities and eccentricities whose innate worth, if we would look so far, might make us blush in the comparison.
I think that's something Dickens does really well, is that kind of social criticism where he says, actually, maybe don't judge appearances, maybe don't assume you know things. And, people underestimate Clemency basically because she's a woman and because she's a servant. And so they assume she isn't clever, and because she can read a little bit, but not very much. So they're like, oh, well, she obviously doesn't know anything. But actually, she knows a lot more about how to understand life than the doctor does, who is the person she works for. And I think that is a really nice element of the Battle of Life that I really like.
Yes. So then after Cricket on the Hearth and Battle of Life,
yeah, The Chimes is my least favourite Christmas story, which is interesting because I think it's the second most famous after A Christmas Carol. I mean, it's a long way less famous, but I do hear about The Chimes more. And when you get editions of A Christmas Carol, they often include another Christmas book or two, not always, but they often include The Chimes more than the other stories, I would say. But I don't actually think The Chimes is as strong as The Battle of Life or The Cricket on the Hearth. I feel like in The Chimes is the one that directly came after A Christmas Carol, and I feel like Dickens just wanted to replicate A Christmas Carol and he kind of failed. It's got a sort of similar ghostly setup, ghosts showing someone visions of the future to kind of make someone learn, and I feel like actually it's sort of like a weak, watered down Christmas Carol, whereas The Battle of Life and The Cricket of Hearth, Dickens is doing something completely different, I suppose, so therefore it kind of holds up. They can kind of hold their own a bit more.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, I can sort of see that. I think what's interesting about the Chimes is that Dickens believed that it was better than A Christmas Carol when he was writing
interesting.
It's so interesting. You think, what? But he was so behind the cause of the story, and he delivers it with such an extra punch and so uncompromisingly that he obviously.
The social criticism in The Chimes is great, but I think the story is not. And I think that is something you do find in Dickens, is that Dickens is fantastic at social criticism, but he is best when his balance between plot and social criticism is perfect and balanced. And sometimes he leans too far one way or too far the other way. And actually in The Chimes, I think the social criticism is excellent, but the stuff around the social criticism is much less good than the social criticism. And therefore, as a whole, it doesn't work as well in comparison to A Christmas Carol, which does have a lot of social criticism in it, but actually the story is also, and the characterization is kind of also perfect. And the story kind of carries the social critique rather than the other way around, I suppose.
Yeah. And I think actually, A Christmas Carol wins because he writes A Christmas Carol and not a pamphlet on working conditions.
Yeah.
He takes the decision to write a really fun, amazing story. Yeah. Whereas I think some of the pamphleteering comes in with The Chimes, and just too many awful things happen that are hard to come back from. It's just there's not enough of the light to pull you out of it. You don't have Fred laughing and playing games.
Yeah, you don't have the light and shade, which Dickens can do so well.
Yeah, I have to look it up, but there's this very famous drawing, which you might know, of Dickens sitting reading the chimes to a select group of friends. And it's drawn, I think it's just drawn from life. And I must be projecting this on him, but it looks like a lot of the people that sat round, like Carlyle and Forster, they don't look like they're really enjoying it. I mean, I think Forster sort of looks like he's basically just had his head in his hands throughout a lot of it.
Oh dear, yeah. It doesn't have the charm, does it?
No, it doesn't have the charm. And he is a charming writer, isn't he?
Yeah.
At his best. You have a new book coming out, The Secrets of Hartwood Hall. I have in my hand here an advance copy that your publisher sent me very kindly. And I just thought, I might read the first chapter just before our chat. And of course, I'm now about 4 or 5 chapters in. I've got really, really stuck on that. So what led you to write it? Where has this come from?
Yeah, from lots of places, I suppose. So The Secrets of Hartwood Hall is my first book. It's my debut novel. It's coming out in March 2023. And it is sort of a love letter to Victorian literature in a way. So I love Victorian literature. I've been reading Victorian literature since I was a teenager and, hugely love it. And I've always been hugely kind of inspired by it. And I wanted to write a book that was set in the Victorian period, that was kind of in conversation with Victorian literature, looking at some kind of tropes from Victorian literature, but also kind of twisting them and doing different things with them, I suppose. And that's kind of how The Secrets of Hartwood Hall came into being. So it's quite Bronte-esque, I suppose. In some ways, definitely lots of like Jane Eyre vibes going on. It's about a governess who is also a widow. She was married for 3 years, and then after her husband's death, she takes on a new position because she needs to find somewhere to live and somewhere to work. And she ends up going to this place called Hartwood Hall, this big spooky house in the middle of nowhere, where strange things are clearly going on. And she's trying to work out what exactly is the situation with this unusual family that she is suddenly part of, and everything kind of goes on from there.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm sort of trying to cut you off because I don't want it spoiled for me because I'm enjoying it. I don't want you to ruin it. So this is good.
I won't say more. Yeah.
Okay, but I definitely picked up a slight Jane Eyre vibe and a little bit of, she sort of slightly reminds me of Esther Summerson, possibly a tiny bit as well, arriving at this big house, not really knowing what's coming next.
Yeah. I definitely feel like the Bronte vibes are definitely on the surface in Hartwood Hall, but there's definitely lots of Dickens vibes underneath. And Dickens, I find Dickens hugely influential and I love his books massively. And I feel like the way he writes and the way he creates these very kind of unusual characters is something that I love and that I feel is really interesting to kind of learn from as a writer, I suppose.
You read all of Dickens by the time you were 18?
I did, yeah. All his novels, yeah.
That's extraordinary.
I just really like Dickens. I read Our Mutual Friend first when I was 13 and I just really, really enjoyed it. So then I just carried on and just read my way through.
So you started with a really easy one then. That's...
I love Our Mutual Friend is still my favorite Dickens, and it's my favorite book ever. And it was my mum's favorite book, so it's my mum's favorite book. So she recommended me start Dickens with Our Mutual Friend, and I did. And actually, in a way, it was a great one to start with because I feel like we've talked a little bit already about gender and Dickens and female characters, and I feel like. Maybe not when I was 13, but when I was 15 or 16, if I'd read the Pickwick Papers first, where all the women are hysterical and fainting, I think I would have been angry. But actually, I started with Our Mutual Friend, where Dickens has these fantastic, fully developed female characters who are wonderful people. And Lizzie Hexam, who's just fantastic and in every way not a damsel in distress in the way that other characters of his much earlier on are. So in a way, Our Mutual Friend was a great one to start with as a teenage girl because it's this fantastic book which has these amazing female characters in. And then I loved it. So I carried on reading Dickens and I read all the rest of them. I don't know what order I read them in, but I know that the last full-length novel I read was The Pickwick Papers when I was 18. And then I read A Christmas Carol, which I'd never read before. So I left A Christmas Carol till right at the end, which is the other way around from most people.
So you were 17, 18 when you read A Christmas Carol?
Yeah, 18, properly. I think, yeah.
Have you seen adaptations before then as well?
Yeah, I must have done. I must have seen films. Yeah, I must have seen films of it. And actually, a lot of the Dickens I read, I had seen adaptations first, because I think especially as a teenager when Dickens wasn't like, I didn't find Dickens daunting because Dickens is a bit wild and hilarious, so it wasn't actually not as dense as someone like George Eliot. But there were a few Dickens where I'd watched the television adaptation first, I kind of enjoyed it and then went in and read the book, which I think is I think some people feel that you must always read the book before you watch a screen adaptation, but I think actually when you're getting into classics, that's you could be too precious about those things, and sometimes it's absolutely fine to experience it a different way first.
That's good to hear.
Yeah, and definitely at the time when I was a teenager, sort of in the 2000s, there were a lot of amazing adaptations of Dickens coming out, that amazing Bleak House in 2005 and the Little Dora adaptation. And there were all these kind of amazing adaptations of Dickens that were really, just exploring Dickens to the full, I suppose, in a great way.
I'd be really interested to know, since you're so widely read on the 19th century, if you're forced right this second, and bear in mind you won't be held to it forever, but right in this moment right now, how do you rank the leading 19th century authors, if you have to? Who would be your top 5?
So Dickens is my favourite.
Okay.
Then Elizabeth Gaskell, probably my second favourite. I love Elizabeth Gaskell. Then Anthony Trollope. And then I don't know who would be next. I love Thomas Hardy a lot. I'm really fond of all the Brontes, but they wrote less books, so it's kind of hard to very hard to compare Emily Bronte with just Wuthering Heights to Thomas Hardy with 14 novels, because I love Wuthering Heights more than any of Thomas Hardy's 14 novels, but Thomas Hardy wrote a lot more books, so it's very hard to rank them, I suppose. George Gissing I also am really fond of, who's very underrated, but I really like. And I'm still quite early in my journey with George Gissing. I've only read sort of 4 or 5 of his books, but I like him a lot. Yeah, I feel like that's probably nearly 5. I'm rarely, for someone who loves Victorian literature, I'm not a huge George Eliot fan.
I was going to say, where's George Eliot?
I know. I don't actually really get on with George Eliot's writing, which I know is sort of a great sin for someone who loves Victorian literature, that I'm not a massive George Eliot fan. I've read quite a lot of her books, but I don't hugely get on with her writing.
Do you know, that's so interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
That thing we were talking about, the Battle of Life, and how personal it is, that somehow...
Yeah.
I was blown away. I've still not read Middlemarch, which is ridiculous, because I go on about how much I like it, but Silas Marner and The Mill on the Floss, I thought they were excellent.
You see, The Mill on the Floss is my least favourite book, possibly
of the entire century.
I really hate Dracula as well, but because for many reasons, I don't love Dracula. Dracula is a unredeemed, like, I have a lot of problems with the female characters in Dracula, and it's not redeemed by like a really strong plot for me. But that's a whole other story that I don't get into. But The Mill and the Floss I really don't like, and I can't stand the ending, and I get very cross with it. But George Eliot's one of those authors where I don't like her writing personally. I don't get on with it. I don't like her style, but I completely respect her. Like, I think she was a fantastic author who wrote about really interesting and important things in these kind of rich, fantastic books that are really interesting. But I just don't get on with her writing. And I think actually, we often talk about Victorian literature as like it's one thing, whereas actually the Victorian period is, a long period of time filled with various different books of various different genres. A lot of actually kind of the more highbrow Victorian authors like George Eliot, I'm not quite so fond of, whereas Dickens, who's this really kind of Victorian commercial writer, writing for everyone, I really love his books and I love his humour, whereas George Eliot I find a little bit dry. But I'm sort of very aware that that's my very like personal opinion, and actually I kind of respect her books. I've read Middlemarch, I think twice, maybe 3 times.
Well, that's pretty good going.
Yeah, and I've read 5 of her books, and I do kind of really admire her books, and she had a really interesting life. I find her really interesting as a person, but I just can't quite get on with her writing.
Yes.
Yeah.
And as it's the 19th century rather than necessarily the Victorian era, where does Jane Austen?
Oh, actually, that's true. I was just ranking Victorian. If I were ranking 19th century as a whole, Jane Austen would be at number 2 with Elizabeth Gaskell fighting her for second place. I can never decide which I love more, because I love Jane Austen and Elizabeth Gaskell a lot, and I can never decide quite which I prefer.
But Dickens is your number 1, and that's not just because you're on a Dickens podcast. Okay.
No, Dickens is always number 1. I'm currently embarking on reading all of Dickens in publication order. So I've just finished The Pickwick Papers and Oliver Twist, and then next month I'm going to read Nicholas Nickleby, and I'm going to work my way through in publication order, which I think will be really interesting, because I haven't done that before. Because I do think his books change really interestingly kind of over the course of his career. So I think it'd be quite interesting to read them in order and see how things change. Absolutely.
Yeah, I've been sort of zigzagging all over the place. I have to ask you then, if you've just reread The Pickwick Papers, what did you think of The Goblins Who Stole a Sexton?
Yes. It's so clearly the kind of precursor to A Christmas Carol. It's really interesting because he must have written The Goblins Who Stole a Sexton in, I guess, 6 years before A Christmas Carol. And he obviously was kind of taken with the idea and just wanted to do more with it. And so he wrote this kind of fuller version that is, very, it's the same kind of central premise, I suppose, of someone who is miserable at Christmas and who is, doesn't think that Christmas is a good time and, is uncharitable and, mean and unhappy, being kind of taken away by mysterious beings who are going to show him the error of his ways. And it is quite fun to see how he the idea for A Christmas Carol was obviously in his head for a long time, which is quite fun, I think.
Yeah. It's been fantastic talking to you, Katie.
Thank you.
And The Secrets of Hartwood Hall is available for pre-order now. And you're going to come back in the new year and talk a little bit more about digging into the 19th century.
So, yeah.
It'd be lovely to talk about that, because it takes place in 1852. Is that
1852,
right?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah. Well, no, I really look forward to that.
Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, and have a wonderful Christmas, and see you in the new year.
Thank you, and you. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas. Thank you for listening to Charles Dickens' A Brain on Fire. If you're enjoying these episodes and would like to make a small donation towards the costs of producing them, please follow the link at the bottom of the description and you can make a donation there. Every coffee you buy makes a huge difference. Thank you ever so much, and see you next time.